course, Democrats across the country are ecstatic at their election results, and they should be. It was a good day for Democrats. It was a good day for dispelling the dark cloud that has hung over the party since the election of Donald Trump 1 year ago. So it is a good feeling to see that the country has not fallen into the grip of some Twilight Zone-like madness. It is a relief to see people voting for something other than hate, for people rejecting, in fact, the explicit campaign of Trumpian hate conducted, for example, by Republican gubernatorial candidate Ed Gillespie in Virginia. But I thought we would look at that race a little bit differently in a slightly different context. And I want to start with this. A CNN poll released the same day that Americans went to the polls found that favorable views of the Democratic Party have dropped to their lowest mark in more than a quarter century of polling. Now, the poll, which was conducted by SSRS for CNN, found that only 37% of Americans have a favorable view of the Democratic Party. That's down significantly, down from 44% in March of this year. So that's really not a long time. It's 7-8 months. A majority of Americans, according to this poll, have an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party. Now, for some context that CNN didn't lead with, it is true that the Republican Party is even more unpopular. Only 30% of Americans hold a favorable view of the party, and the party already hit its lowest point in 25 years of polling back in September. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us, first of all, that voters really, really don't like Republicans. It tells us also that voters don't like Democrats. Maybe they don't dislike them as much, but Democrats are not yet popular. Now, it also tells us that in an off-year election, turnout, as it always is, even in presidential elections, is crucial. Democrats showed up and Republicans did not show up enough to carry their candidates to victory. Now, there is something else that's important to understand about this election, and it's this. According to 538 and other political scientists and pollsters, the Democratic win in Virginia was virtually identical to what the statistics predicted for that win. If I can find that citation easily, I will look it up for you. But the bottom line is this. Ralph Northam in Virginia didn't win because he was a centrist, and he didn't win because he was a extreme progressive. He won because voters were in the mood to turn Republicans out of office, especially those that showed up in the turnout to vote. Now, what's interesting about that is that of course, people are trying to spin the results, particularly of the Northam race, to their advantage. I was watching CNN election night. I saw Jen Psaki, who was a former press secretary to Barack Obama, who is an advocate for what you might call the centrist or establishment wing of the party, insisting that the victory of Ralph Northam proved that voters in many states wanted a centrist, that progressive so-called litmus tests were a bad idea, and she also insisted that Northam's progressive primary challenger, Tom Perriello, would not have won or would not have done as well. That's completely false. According to the modeling, any Democrat would have done roughly the same, and that presumably includes Tom Perriello. He was a good progressive. So if that's true, then number one question is, what kind of Democrats should run in such a way that they get a mandate to actually change things once they're in office? That's question number one. And by the way, it also is a little cautionary story about punditry, because when the centrist in Georgia, who supposedly was quote unquote matched to the district, just as Ms. Psaki was advocating the other night as the reason for Northam's success, When they did the same thing in Georgia with a candidate, John Ossoff, and he lost and failed to meet even Hillary Clinton's numbers in that suburban district in Georgia, I found this editorial from none other than Jen Psaki. Headline: Democrats don't lose your cool over Georgia vote. It began: Democrats don't lose your mind and your motivation over John Ossoff's defeat. Many thought they needed a win, meaning Democrats in a special election this cycle. They don't. And the whole message was, even when you lose, special elections can offer an opportunity to try out a message and a window into the strengths and weaknesses of the opposing party. So, the gist of it was, if a centrist loses, no big deal. If a centrist wins, obviously it's because of the centrism. That's taking the wrong message away from the election. You could argue, as a matter of fact, that the real story out of Virginia is some of the down ballot wins, and those down ballot wins include Danica Roem. Danica Roem, interesting case study. She defeated the Virginia legislator who wrote the anti-trans bathroom bill. Because for some reason, Republicans, maybe it's a Freudian thing, but or they didn't get adequate potty training or something, but they seem to be awfully fixated on bathrooms. So this guy wrote the anti-trans bathroom bill. He described himself proudly as a proud homophobe. He lost to Danica Roem, who is a trans woman and a heavy metal singer. So those of us who have gone from rock and roll to politics can also feel we have some representation in electoral politics tonight. So that was a major rebuke. But Roem did not run on her own identity per se. She ran about traffic. And if you live in that or work or travel through that portion of Northern Virginia that she will represent, traffic is a nightmare there. So she ran on upgrading Route 29. All politics is local and all of that. So, and she was very gracious in victory. She said she would not say anything negative about her opponent because he was now her constituent, and she doesn't speak ill of her constituents. Nicely done, Danica Roem. Also an ex-Marine who is a socialist, won in Manassas. So we saw a huge down-ballot surge of very progressive Democrats, as well as Democrats all across the spectrum, as we will discuss hopefully elsewhere on this show. We also saw the victory of Phil Murphy for governor of New Jersey. That was as expected. Murphy, there's no ambiguity about it. Even though he's ex-Goldman Sachs, he ran a very progressive campaign. So basically, these were states that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016. They were states that were expected to go Democratic. Perhaps the surprises, particularly given gerrymandering, were some of the wins further down ballot. Another lesson, and this goes back to something I talk about over and over again because I think it's very important for the future of the Democratic Party. People who vote Democratic, and it's true in this election as well as in others, tend to be demographically more likely to be women, more likely to be younger, more likely to be people of color. So I go back to the recent Harvard-Harris poll in which respondents were asked, Democratic-based voters now we're talking about, were asked this question. The question they were asked was, do you support or oppose movements that seek to move the Democratic Party further to the left and replace its current leaders? Now, voters were asked support or oppose. Now, striking finding number one, a majority of Democrats, 52%, support movements to move the party to the left and replace its current leaders. Now, contrary to the Bernie bro myth that is so beloved among centrist Democrats, it turns out that this Democratic left future is black, brown, young, and female. In other words, where white voters wanted to support these movements, 46%, in other words, more opposed than supporting, African American voters supported these movements, 55%. Hispanic voters, 65%. Women, 55%. Voters ages 18 to 34, 69%. So the future of the party, in every sense, chronological and demographic, is left. Now, what does that mean? It means that in elections where districts are gerrymandered, where the electorate is more polarized than at any time in modern history, it is more than ever not about persuadable Republicans, but by turning out your base to vote. So I hope Democrats take the right lesson from this election and do not make the mistake of following the misinterpretive advice of the Jen Psaki's of this world. Now, I'm sure she's a very nice person. I just think she got this one very wrong. A couple other thoughts, by the way. There was, of course, another Democratic Party flap recently, and that had to do with Donna Brazil's new book and Donna Brazil's revelation that there was a secret agreement between the Hillary Clinton candidacy campaign and the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. Now, Donna Brazil has revealed the existence of a secret agreement that allowed the party allowed the campaign to overrule the DNC leadership. They had to hire people from a list that the Clinton campaign had approved of. They had to review strategic decisions with the Clinton campaign, which in return loaned it money. And in a codicil of that deal that didn't get much reporting, the Clinton campaign also had the right to review anything the DNC said about any individual presidential candidate. Now, that's a big deal. And the weekend was filled. First of all, everybody was sure that Donna Brazil had ruined Ralph Northam's chances by demotivating Democratic voters. Well, it turns out Democratic voters are more determined than that. In fact, downstate, Democratic experts, as we will learn, as we will hear later in the show, didn't really hear much about it. But let's just, because social media was burning about this, let's just clear a couple things up. First of all, there was a claim that the Clinton team only had the right, could only invoke its powers over the DNC, if you will, in the general election. That's false. The agreement did carry a legal disclaimer to that effect, but as Attorney Brendan Fisher of the Campaign Legal Center commented, that clause is, quote, contradicted by the entire rest of the agreement. Fisher also pointed to a provision that said, quote, Clinton controlled in his words, Clinton controlled every communication mentioning a primary candidate. That's any primary candidate. There was also the story that the Sanders campaign, and again, I worked for Bernie Sanders on that campaign, that the Sanders campaign was offered the same deal. It was not. It was offered a deal without that side part about controlling everything. Okay. In fact, I reviewed the email. It said, quote, DNC staff would be happy to chat with the Sanders team and come to an understanding about the best way to use their funds to prepare for the general election. Completely different deal. Now, why does this matter? In one sense, it doesn't, because it didn't affect the outcome of the Tuesday vote. But in another sense, it very much does. Not to prove that anybody's a terrible person, but to prove, number one, the DNC was out of money and had to go begging. That should never happen again. Number two, it cut a secret side deal. The DNC must be transparent. Number three, bigger than any of this, we need a truly democratic party. That means a party where people can register the same day as Democrats, or very soon before the election, in order to vote in the primary. That's a way to draw people in, but party leaders in some states are resisting that. You know, New York State, if you wanted to vote in June of next year, early primary voting, you had to register by last October 23rd. That's nonsense. That's undemocratic. That's going to and I'm speaking of independents who wanted to re-register as Democrats. That's absolute madness. The party has got to be more accessible It's got to be more democratic. They've got to do something about getting rid of these superdelegates. And they've got to stop being so dependent on big money donors. So let us agree on a couple things, if you will. If you disagree, send me a note. Tweet at me at RJ Eskow, whatever you like to do, or TZHRJ for the 0 Hour with RJ Eskow. But in conclusion, here's what I take away from all of this. The Democratic Party has not been behaving all that democratically, but it has a chance to take to really win some elections going forward if it does not discourage its own voters, if it understands that the game is turnout, not persuading squishy Republicans, and 3, if it offers some really meaningful policies that will change people's lives. Now, hating Trump may give it a little momentum, but to build on that, it's got to stand for something. I still believe that. We stand for interpreting these facts for you, and we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The 0 Hour.